The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. The Gospel of Mark that Anne read this morning is a bit of a study in contrasts. It paints two opposing scenes. We begin the story with Mary of Magdala, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. And when we last saw them, if you were reading through in the Gospel of Mark, they were the last three people in the sort of company of Jesus, amongst the disciples of Jesus, who stood with him at the cross when he was crucified. All the others had disappeared and fled. These three remained steadfast to the very end. We do not know when they joined the company of Jesus, unlike the men. We know when some of them did, the Gospels tell us. But the Gospels never tell us when any of the women begin to follow Jesus, but we can assume that they have been there for a long time and that they are probably now considered the chief of the disciples, since they are the ones that are faithful. When Jesus died, it was the end of Friday afternoon. There were only a few hours left to bury him before Sabbath restrictions on Friday evening at sunset came into being. And so I imagine that these three faithful women, these three faithful disciples, spent most of Sabbath day trying to figure out how they were going to give Jesus the decent burial that they thought he deserved. And perhaps at sundown on Saturday, when Sabbath restrictions were lifted, they went their separate ways, having conspired during the day for who was going to get what, to get the spices, the ointments, the wrappings, all the things necessary to give Jesus a good Jewish burial. But very likely by the time they had gathered together again with all of their supplies, it was dark and there was no point going out to the tomb. And so we find them on Sunday morning going out to the tomb very early. And there are probably a couple of reasons for this. One, they probably want to get there before it started getting hot and the body started decomposing, making the job more difficult. But also, they were probably going early because at that time fewer people were out and about. And since all of the other disciples had scattered, they were obviously wondering, is it going to end with Jesus, or are they going to come after the rest of us too? And so they're flying under the radar, fretting. We hear a strategic planning session going on amongst the three of them, figuring out how they're going to roll the stone away from the tomb. The scene amongst the three of them is full of fear and despair and grief. At the same time, Mark is painting a different picture outside of the bubble of the three women. He says, very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, as the sun was rising. That's three ways to say new beginning. Early is in the morning is the day is all ahead of you. First day of the week, the whole week is ahead of you. As the sun is rising, it is pushing away the darkness. And so as these women are fretting on their task to get to the tomb, all around them, the world is wakening up and becoming brighter. And as they get to the tomb, the study in contrasts collides. When they get there, they find that the stone has been rolled away. And so all their worrying about who's going to do that becomes moot. They go into the tomb, the body is gone. And so all the running around to get the supplies to give the body a decent burial have come to nothing and are now irrelevant. And to absolutely contrast the figure of darkness versus light in the dark tomb is a young man completely dressed in white clothes, as we see in the other gospel narrative. Some say dazzling white clothes. And there we get the picture of absolute contrast between dark and light, between hope and fear. And the man in white has a message for the women. It's a salvation oracle that is very common amongst the exilic prophets, and especially those of you who have been studying Isaiah with me are familiar with this. It always begins, fear not, do not be afraid. And then always follows something radical that God is doing that will change our reality and our circumstances in ways that we cannot. And so the salvation oracle announces what God is doing. He is risen. He is not here. He will meet you in Galilee. Well, what is the response of the women? It is not joy. The fear that they have is deepened, and they run away in terror and tell no one. And that is the ending, the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why did the Gospel end this way? I don't think we all really know. It's all speculation, but I think one of the best explanations I have come across is that the Gospel of Mark is such an impetuous gospel. It runs immediately from one scene to another, and you are breathless as you are reading through it to catch up to it, so that it carries you along. I once had the privilege of being in a theater where there was an actor in soliloquy on the stage who recited the entire Gospel of Mark from beginning to end. It was a dramatic experience. And I know that by the time I got to the end, after the crucifixion and the annunciation of the resurrection, and hearing the women running away, my heart was beating, saying, but no! And maybe that's part of what Mark intended for the readers who are clued into what the gospel is going on, where it's going all along, to get to that point, to turn them from readers to becoming evangelists themselves. A few years after Mark was written, we don't know how many, the second ending was written and tacked on to the end. And it has the familiar scenes that we get from the rest of the Gospels of Jesus first appearing to Mary of Magdala, and then to the other disciples a couple of times, and then over and over again with these various appearances until they all move up to Galilee and there is a final resurrection appearance, after which they all begin to scatter and proclaim the good news and found churches in all sorts of different directions. And again, you have to ask, why? Why was this new ending written that moved from the fear of the women when they first went into the tomb to this gradual assimilation of belief and hope in the resurrection to the point where they eventually became evangelists themselves? And we know that Mark was written before the Jewish insurrection of the late 60s and early 70s. And very likely the ending was written after. And as we look at that event, that revolt, and how the Romans responded to it, we are all very familiar that in the year 70, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed. But what we're not so familiar with was that the war actually started a couple of years earlier, and the Roman legions were under the command of Vespasian, who later became emperor, largely because of his campaign there in Palestine. And he started in the north, and with his legions, systematically moved south, slaughtering everyone that they encountered. They did not ask if you were Christian or if you were Jewish when they came to Jerusalem. They razed it, and they continued on south until they got to the southern fortress of Masada, which they besieged for a few years as they built a ramp up to the mountain to finally break that siege, and the war was over. It was a traumatic event. The temple was gone. Judaism, as we now know it, was born out of that trauma, with the synagogue alone, and the synagogue now standing in the place of the temple. It was traumatic for Christians who were living in Palestine as well. To this point, the church in Jerusalem was the center of Christianity. Undoubtedly, after this point, the power center of Christianity moved to the churches around the Mediterranean that missionaries like Paul founded, and the church became something else. Jews in the diaspora, also living around the Mediterranean, were not harmed in any way. They had long relationships with the Roman Empire and were deeply entwined in the economy and the local governing structures. The Christians were the newcomers. And anytime there was something that happened that was irregular, couldn't be explained away, or blame needed to be shifted onto one group of people, it was this new group of Christians that were picked on. And so while Judaism was able to kind of recover from the Civil War, at least in the diaspora, and form itself, Christianity found itself under persecution, and the trauma of that insurrection in Palestine continued periodically, sporadically, throughout the Mediterranean basin. And that's why I think this second ending to Mark was written, to move the ending of the gospel from fear, to help the traumatized church come to terms with the possibility and the power of the resurrection, and move the church to the point where they understand that the presence of the living Christ is with them now and always, and empowers us to be the church in whatever circumstances we may find ourselves. And that movement from fear to freedom and dealing with trauma, I think, describes what we have been through over the last year. Globally, the pandemic has been traumatic for the entire population of the planet. We have been traumatized by secondary things triggered by the pandemic all throughout this past year. And I don't know about you, but this week, as I've been driving back and forth from the church office to home and listening to the news radio station that I listen to, I've heard excerpts that are going on from the George Floyd trial. And I've been re-traumatized over that event again, too, this week. We know the pandemic is ending. We know it's coming to a conclusion. We know that there is hope and brightness in the future. We were able to celebrate our first Sunday worship service this morning in the sanctuary in over a year at 8:30, and it was wonderful, but we know we're not there yet. But I remember the deep pieces of the trauma we experienced. I remember what it was like that first week after we held our last worship service in the sanctuary and our first attempt at worship on Zoom. I felt lost, disoriented, hopeless. I had no idea how we were going to go forward and be authentic church. And at that time, we were looking at maybe a 12-week period, and we were told it would kind of be over 6 weeks up for the pandemic, 6 weeks down on the other side. By summer, late spring, we'd be back to normal. It's been a year. And yet, in the middle of that disruption, in the middle of that trauma, we have found sacred space. We have found the presence of the risen Christ among us. We have found our heart again in mission, in generously giving to others who have fewer resources than we do. And we know that we will come out on the other side of this pandemic. But when we do, will we be the same church that went into the pandemic? Probably not. And we're going to have to begin thinking about the future. Here's one little piece that is obvious, but we don't realize it until we say it out loud. In 2050, people my age, and mostly people your age, who we consider pillars and leaders of the church, will no longer be with us. That's a simple fact. Who will replace us? As we look around, we have already raised a couple of generations of people who are outside of the church, who've never been in the church, who don't care to enter a church, who don't care what the church is about. And those that do have a different way of connecting, have a different way of defining commitment, have different values and different priorities and different ways of getting things done. And with those two realities, I wonder, what will the church of 2050 look like? How are we going on the other side of this pandemic going to deal with the trauma that is coming and lay the groundwork for a church that will exist in 2050? I honestly don't know. But I suspect that there are things that we have learned about ourselves throughout the pandemic, shifts that we have made that we can look at maybe a little more deeply that may give us some clues for how we can lay the groundwork, not for a church that just survives in 2050, but for a church that thrives in 2050. And here's one thing I am certain of. The risen Christ who met Mary of Magdala after the resurrection is the same risen Christ who later met the apostles in various locations. It's the same risen Christ who brought them all together in Galilee for one final appearance and sending out is the same risen Christ that we have encountered in our sanctuary and in our meetings and in our fellowship before the pandemic, is the same risen Christ who has been with us through the pandemic, is the same risen Christ who will greet us when we are able to come back and be authentic church together in person, and it will be that same risen Christ who will be there to greet the church in 2050. We can choose to live in fear of the future, or we can hold on to the promise of the resurrection and the freedom it gives us to imagine what we can become and how the church can thrive in the future. And I am convinced that God will give us the gifts and God will give us the graces in order for us to make that journey to be the authentically thriving church of 30 years from now. I choose to live in hope. I choose to live in God's promises and not in fear. I choose to proclaim to you all, Happy Easter. Christ is risen again. Hallelujah.